The most pressing issue for clinical trials for CROs is the question of the timelines. That means the timelines for the assessment and the approval of clinical trials. This means once you have filed the application to run a clinical trial, the question is how long do you have to wait until you obtain the results of the assessment from the competent authority and their approval to start with the clinical trial. And this is of course very important for the CROs and the sponsors, but also a political issue because Europe is currently facing an increasing competition also from other non-European countries for hosting clinical trials. And therefore it's also a political question in order to be, let's say, capable to run clinical trials in Europe, otherwise sponsors will go to other parts of the world. And there are basically three stakeholders, which is the European Commission, which is the European Parliament, and which is the European Council. The latter is a group which is representing the member states. And the EU Commission proposed a timeline of 41 days, and the Council is of the opinion that it would be better to have 85 days, which led to a lot of resistance, as you can imagine, from the industry, because this is too long. And now all three stakeholders on the European level have entered in a so-called trialogue. That means they are negotiating what might be the best timeline, and it will probably something in between 41 and 85 days, and we hope for the CROs but also for the sponsors that it will be close to 41. But it's really very hard to predict. We are helping ACRO to file the opinion of ACRO and to convince the European competent authorities that this is basically the best for the industry and does also not endanger patient safety. And we should also add that the 40 days are the timeline for an application where the competent authority has no questions. The trialogue should be through and the respective negotiations in January, February 2014. And you should also have in mind that we have elections for the EU Parliament and that all three negotiation partners are aiming to end the entire process before the elections. And the elections are in the summer, so that we hope that the new clinical trial regulation will be through up to, until then. Time is of essence. Clinical trials are very important for Europe because it's not only the clinical trial itself, but it's also the entire research environment around the clinical trial, and the question that universities and researchers are involved, and if, let's say, clinical trials should move to other parts of the world, we would also lose a sort of, or certain sort of competitive edges in that respect, and therefore it's very important. ACRO, with the experience of the global CROs it represents, can offer regulators a lot of values. ACRO members are at the coalface of the everyday work on clinical trials on behalf of sponsors, and the inclusion of ACRO members in national level industry committees could benefit the regulators a lot. We at Clifford Chance are currently helping ACRO to connect with the relevant competent authorities and regulators on a national level in Europe, but also with the trade associations of the sponsors who are very active in that respect as well. And we aim that ACRO will be recognized as a valuable and legitimate stakeholder in that respect, and also to provide a platform for constant collaboration with the competent authorities in Europe and with other stakeholders. I think ACRO is very important for the CRO industry, and I think there are some reasons that they are even going to be more important in the future. Because we are facing more and more harmonization on clinical trial and data protection regulation. And in former times, the CROs were more looking to national regulation, but this now becomes harmonized. And the ACRO members are also acting with a global perspective, and therefore I think that ACRO is very important to have, let's say, an eye on the global development of everything which is important for the clinical research organizations. I think I would also like to add that the sponsors are more and more outsourcing clinical research and services, and that this also leads to higher importance of clinical research organizations, because they are becoming more and more the constant institution or organization for conducting clinical trials in that respect. And then they have also to face more duties, more regulations and more responsibilities which were in former times with the sponsor solely. I think the biggest challenge is the change of the setup of the entire relationship between the sponsors on the one hand and the CROs on the other. And what we see is a sort of outsourcing process. That means that CROs are not only pure third-party service provider, but that they take over essential parts of the work of their sponsors, so that the sponsors can really concentrate on the research and the distribution of pharmaceutical products, but that they are not anymore, let's say, involved in conducting clinical trials, and that they are outsourcing this to CROs. And I think this will lead to a huge change of the role of the CROs, which are becoming much more important, but which also have to bear much more responsibilities in order to fulfill their roles. And this leads back to the importance and the position of ACRO. The more this change will continue, it will be really important to have a strong industry trade association for CROs, just to look that the interest of the CROs are really considered on a global basis. I think there are two important developments we should also mention here. One development is transparency, the other is compliance. When it comes to transparency, the pharmaceutical industry is currently facing a lot of demands to be more transparent. And they are introducing, for instance, the Sunshine Act legislation as codes of conduct in Europe currently, in order to disclose all payments to HCPs and also to HCOs in future, which will of course also have an impact on the work of the CROs, because this means that they have to pass on all payments which they are paying to the investigators, to their sponsors, so that they can publish them. And this again leads to the question of data protection, because this will only be possible in most of the European states with prior written consent of the HCPs. And you can imagine that this is really also a huge administrative burden for all participants. And the way to move ahead is very different from member state to member state. There are some countries which are implementing Sunshine Act legislation as a legislation, as mandatory law, for instance in France, which is the most prominent country, and some other smaller countries. There is another model which you can find in the Netherlands, where there is let's say, voluntary collaboration or agreement between the state on the one hand and all other stakeholders, including the associations and organizations of physicians. That means you have the state, the trade associations of the pharmaceutical industry, and the associations of HCPs. FPA, which is the umbrella trade association of the pharmaceutical industry in Europe, has just released a so-called HCP-HCO disclosure code, which will now be transformed by the National Trade Association in transparency codes. And these codes are voluntary, basically, but mandatory for the member companies of these trade associations. And in some countries, non-compliance with these codes will also be sanctions, but by the trade associations in a sort of arbitration proceeding.